I used to think winter silence was peaceful, something clean, something healing. But the older I get, the more I realize that silence can be a warning too. When the air goes still, when the forest hushes, when even the snow seems to pause before it falls, sometimes that means something is watching. And on that night, deep in the northern Rockies, with my old Volkswagen Westphalia creaking under a shell of ice, I learned exactly how wrong a person can be about peace. I started that trip because I needed to get away from people. Not for dramatic reasons, just fatigue. The constant noise of town, the same routines, the same polite conversations that never went deeper than the surface. I'd been drifting through my days like a ghost wearing a jacket, and I thought maybe a little adventure would shake something loose. I'd camped in winter plenty of times before, but I'd never gone completely solo in conditions this brutal. Temperatures dropping below zero at night, heavy snowfall in the forecast, roads that barely counted as roads. It wasn't smart, but at that point in my life, comfort felt more dangerous than the cold. My name's Aaron. I'm 32, grew up mostly around Colorado, moved for work, moved again, lost myself a little in the shuffle. My Westphalia, a faded orange 1986 I'd rebuilt with my own hands, was the only thing that still felt familiar. Its engine rattled like an asthmatic smoker. Its heater smelled faintly of old socks, and the sliding door had to be hip-checked to close properly. But it was mine. And on that trip, it felt like the only steady thing I still had. The gravel road leading to the campground was nearly buried under layers of hard-packed snow. In some spots, drifts rose 3 or 4 feet high, sculpted by the wind into shapes that almost looked like faces. I had the chains on, creeping along in first gear, listening to the wind scrape across the metal roof. It wasn't a campground most people knew about, just 6 primitive spots around a frozen creek, still open in winter only because nobody bothered to close it. I liked places like that, overlooked, forgotten, left to the elements. Felt fitting. When I rolled into the loop, nobody else was there. I killed the engine, and the silence pressed in immediately, thick and absolute. There wasn't even birdsong, just the faint crack of ice shifting out on the creek. The sun was dipping low behind the ridge, washing everything in that pale blue glow that only winter knows how to make. I stepped out and my breath crystallized instantly. The cold was sharp enough to sting my eyes. I set up camp the same way I always do, leveled the van as best as the frozen ground allowed, unlatched the pop-top, laid out my sleeping bag, and checked the propane. Inside the Westphalia, the old interior lights flickered once before stabilizing, casting the cabin in a dull amber glow. Something about that color always makes me feel young again, like I'm back on childhood camping trips with my parents before everything got complicated. But nostalgia didn't last long that night. While I unpacked my stove, I noticed something strange near the tree line. Tracks. Human tracks. At first I thought maybe a hunter had passed through earlier, but something about them made me pause. They were spaced too close together, almost like the person had taken unusually small steps. And the pattern didn't lead toward the road or the creek. Instead, they ran parallel to the camp loop, just inside the trees. A wandering path that didn't seem to have a destination. The snow in the prints wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. A day, maybe 2. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It's public land. People wander. People explore. People get weird when they're trying to clear their heads. I'm one of them. Still, I kept glancing at them while I heated up my dinner. My gut kept tugging in a direction my brain didn't want to look. By the time darkness settled, the temperature had already dropped to -13. The cold bit at any exposed skin, and even inside the van, with the heater running, I could feel the chill seeping through the metal panels. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped it up to my chin, and checked the time. 9:47 p.m. Early, but winter nights stretch long, and I was worn out from the drive. I must have dozed off. I'm not entirely sure. What I do know is that at some point in the night, I woke to a sound I couldn't place, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it might be ice cracking on the creek, or snow falling off branches, or maybe even the Westphalia contracting in the cold. Old vehicles make all sorts of noises when the temperature plummets, but the taps were too regular, too intentional. 3 taps, silence. 3 taps again. They were coming from the passenger side of the van. I held my breath and listened harder, trying not to move. The interior lights were off, and the only glow came from the faint outline of the moon through the frost-covered windows. Everything looked distorted through that ice. Shadows felt too close, shapes too tall. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. I wanted to believe it was a branch, but there weren't any trees close enough to touch the metal. The nearest one was at least 10 feet away. I slowly reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight, feeling the cold metal bite into my palm. My heart was hammering so loudly, I wondered if whoever or whatever was outside could hear it too. For a long moment, the tapping stopped. Silence wrapped around the van so suddenly it felt like sound itself had frozen. Then something brushed against the sliding door. Not a tap. Not a knock. A slow, deliberate drag, like fingertips trailing across the metal. I froze completely. My lungs locked up. The hair on the back of my neck stood rigid. Something was outside, and it was close. The dragging paused near the handle, right where someone would pull if they wanted to open it. I swallowed hard, barely daring to breathe. My mind raced through explanations, wind, ice, and animal, but none of them fit. Animals don't move like that. Wind doesn't drag, ice doesn't pause with intent. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity. When the sound finally stopped, I didn't relax. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against the van like a weight. It took another minute before I found the courage to shift my position. I clicked on the flashlight, the beam skittering across the ceiling. I didn't want to look out the window. Every instinct screamed not to. But curiosity is its own kind of sickness, and fear has a way of pushing you toward the thing you most want to avoid. I leaned toward the frosted glass and wiped a small circle clear with my sleeve. There were footprints in the snow, fresh ones, leading right up to my van, and not leading away. My breath, the small circle of glass until I had to wipe it again, my hand trembling. The footprints were unmistakable, crisp edges, deep impressions. Someone had been there moments before. Someone close enough to touch the door if they wanted. The pattern of the steps was the same, strange spacing I'd noticed earlier near the trees. Unusually small, almost childlike, but the stride length was inconsistent, like whoever made them struggled to decide how to walk. I scanned for a trail leading away, but there was nothing. No return steps. Just the single path that ended at the side of my van. Snow that fresh should have recorded everything, but the away tracks were missing. Like the person had simply evaporated into the night. A gust of wind hit then, sharp, sudden, violent enough to make the Westphalia rock once on its struts. I jerked back instinctively, heart racing, and the flashlight beam swung wildly. Panic clawed at me, whispering that maybe I'd missed the departure tracks because I was too focused on the approach. I forced myself to check again, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. Still nothing. A strange silence settled again, but it felt different now. Not the heavy quiet of winter, more like the air itself was holding its breath with me. I backed away from the window and sank onto the cushion. The heater hummed softly, doing its best to fight the cold creeping through the van walls. I desperately wanted to believe I was overreacting, that maybe I'd misread the shadows or the footprints were older than they looked. But deep down, some instinct older than reason whispered that I wasn't alone and hadn't been for hours. I stayed awake, sitting upright in my sleeping bag, listening to every tick and groan the van made as the temperature continued falling outside. My mind kept looping around the same question: what kind of person wanders a remote campground in sub-zero temperatures? And why approach a stranger's van without announcing themselves? Sometime past midnight, the wind picked up again. Snow rattled against the pop-top canvas. The Westphalia swayed slightly, and I could feel the cold growing sharper. I checked the propane levels, still fine, and tried to steady my breathing. That's when the second sound started. It wasn't tapping this time. It was softer, quicker, like footsteps moving outside in the snow, but not normal footsteps. These were close together, odd in rhythm, as if the person or thing was shifting their weight strangely with each step. I closed my eyes for a moment, gathering myself before leaning toward the window again. I pressed my ear near the cold glass. The footsteps paused, then started again, circling the van. My heart pounded in my throat. Every primal instinct screamed that the thing outside wasn't moving naturally. The steps were too cautious, too light, almost nervous, like it was trying not to be heard but wasn't good at it. At one point, the steps stopped directly behind the van, where the engine bay jutted out. I felt the faintest vibration, like someone brushing lightly against the exterior. I sucked in a breath and held it, straining to hear anything, breathing, whispering, anything human. Nothing. Eventually, the footsteps drifted away into the trees. I didn't move for minutes afterward, not even to blink. I waited for something. Another noise, another drag of fingers across metal, another set of taps. But the night went still again. Somewhere deep in my chest, a faint courage flickered. Not bravery exactly, more like a stubborn refusal to be toyed with. I grabbed my boots, quietly unzipped the sleeping bag, and prepared myself for the cold blast that would hit the moment I cracked open the sliding door. I wasn't going out to confront anything. I wasn't that reckless. I just needed to check the area, maybe get a sense of whether the tracks led anywhere now that some time had passed. The cold slapped me as soon as the door slid open. My breath turned into a thick cloud. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I stepped into the dark. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the night, illuminating the untouched surface of the camp loop. The footprints were still there beside the van, still no trail leading away. I turned the light toward the tree line. Snow glittered like crushed glass under the beam, but no fresh impressions broke its surface. Whoever had been outside was gone, but they hadn't left in any direction I could see. A branch cracked somewhere deeper in the woods. My head snapped toward the sound, but the trees were tall enough and thick enough to swallow the light. My imagination started filling the gaps with shapes that weren't there. Figures that moved when I wasn't looking. Faces peeking from behind trunks. I forced myself to take one slow, deep breath. Then another. The cold started burning my fingers through my gloves. I knew I couldn't stay out long, not if I wanted to keep them working. I circled back toward the van, rail-thin shadows stretching across the snow as the flashlight shook in my hand. Just before I slid the door closed, I took one last look toward the trees, and something caught my eye. Far back, almost to the ridge, a dark silhouette stood between two pines. It wasn't moving. It was just there. Tall, thin, unnaturally straight. Its head didn't tilt or turn toward me. It simply faced my direction, though I couldn't make out features from that distance. My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to get inside. I didn't hesitate. I slid the door shut and locked it with trembling fingers. Then I shut off the flashlight and curled back into my sleeping bag, trying to slow the pounding in my chest. I stayed awake until the faintest hint of dawn bled into the sky, listening, waiting, expecting the silhouette to return. When daylight finally arrived, I felt a small hit of relief until I checked the tree line again. The silhouette was gone. I stepped outside once more, driven by a mix of fear and urgency. The air stung bitterly, colder than the night before. The sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. I scanned the entire ridgeline, the dense forest beyond, and every tree that could have hidden a figure. But what I saw next made every muscle in my body lock up. New footprints, leading from the tree line directly toward my van, not wandering, not circling, a straight, deliberate path, as if the figure had waited for sunrise before approaching. But what made my stomach drop was this. The prints didn't match the first set. These weren't small, inconsistent steps. They were longer, heavier, a different person, a different pattern entirely. Two separate sets of tracks. Two separate visitors, both coming toward me, both with no tracks leading away. And as I stared at those prints in the cold morning light, One detail made the fear settle into something deeper, something more primal. Each step was pressed unnaturally deep, as if whoever made them was carrying more weight than a human should, or pressing down harder, or sinking into the snow in a way that didn't match normal anatomy, like something walked with purpose, or leaned forward, or... I swallowed, lurched. I backed up toward the van, feeling a tremor start in my hands. The silence of the forest felt different again. Not empty, not still, but aware. Like it was waiting for me to understand something I wasn't ready to see. I didn't pack up immediately. Part of me didn't want to move at all, didn't want to draw attention, didn't want to signal fear. I thought about leaving right then, but a deeper instinct gnawed at me. Something wasn't done yet. Something had begun in the night that wasn't going to let me just drive away. The footprints, 2 sets, 2 strangers, 2 impossible trails, all leading to me. I stood there staring down at them, the bitter cold burning my face, when I realized something that made my blood run even colder. One of the sets of prints stopped less than 3 feet behind where I'd been standing, and the snow behind me had no other impressions. Whoever stood there stood silently, watching me while I slept. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The cold bit so sharply into my cheeks that it almost felt warm, like a flush of heat rising through frozen skin. I kept staring at that final footprint behind me, the one that ended abruptly, as if the person who made it had stepped directly behind where I stood and simply stopped existing. My breath came faster, fogging the air in short bursts. I forced myself to step backward toward the van, eyes never leaving the prints. The forest remained silent, too silent, holding its breath the same way I was. The sunlight, filtering through the clouds, sharpened every shadow until the whole world looked carved from cold steel. Inside the Westphalia, I slammed the sliding door shut, locked it, then locked it again, like the second lock would matter. I sat on the edge of the bench seat, staring at my own hands as they shook. Not from the cold, not anymore. Fear had settled deep into my bones, refusing to thaw. I told myself to think logically, to evaluate, to plan, to prepare, but my thoughts spun in circles, tripping over each other. 2 sets of prints, 2 visitors, no departures, a figure between the trees. A dragging hand across the metal, footsteps circling the van. No explanations that fit inside what I believed about the world. But one instinct rose through the chaos, cutting through everything. I needed to leave. I needed to get out while the daylight still held, before whatever had been watching chose to come closer again. I turned the ignition. The Westphalia coughed, sputtered, hesitated in the cold, but finally groaned awake. The engine's low, uneven rumble filled the cabin. It was the most comforting sound I'd heard in hours. I exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. I didn't even bother securing half my gear. I just threw what I could into the back and prepared to drive away from the campground and whatever waited in those trees. But when the tires rolled forward, they slipped. Not much, just enough to jolt the van sideways. The rear wheels weren't grabbing the snow. I backed up, trying to reposition. Another slip. My stomach dropped. I stepped outside again, boots crunching hard on the icy surface, and moved to check the tires. The air hit me like a slap. The deeper cold of early morning, dry, razor-sharp, bit through my clothes instantly. But the cold wasn't what froze me. The rear tires were sunk deeper than they should have been, not stuck, but pressed down, as if something heavy had stood or leaned on the back of the van during the night, compacting the snow beneath the frame. I crouched slowly, feeling every pulse in my body. The snow under the tire was forced hard-packed, almost sculpted, pressed down deeper than my weight could ever have made. Something had been back here. Something heavy. Something tall enough to drag its fingers across the sliding door, lean its weight onto the engine bay, and watch me through the window. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath as I climbed back into the driver's seat. I eased off the clutch, feathered the gas, and let the van inch forward in tiny movements, coaxing the tires to catch. After several tense, grinding seconds, they finally grabbed traction. The van lurched forward. Relief crashed through me so violently I almost cried. I didn't look back at the tree line. Didn't check for silhouettes, didn't check for new footprints. I just drove. The road out was rougher than I remembered. Snow had drifted during the night, filling the ruts I'd made coming in. The Westfalia jolted and bucked, the engine straining, the chains clattering, the steering wheel trembling in my hands. But the further I got from the campground, the more something strange happened inside me. The fear didn't fade, but it changed, shifted. A heavy clarity settled in, like a stone finally hitting the bottom of deep water. There were moments in my life where I'd ignored my instincts, dismissed warning signs, leaned into comfort instead of truth. And those choices had always led me to regret. But this time I listened. I chose motion instead of paralysis, action instead of surrender. The road narrowed as it wound between the pines, the snow piled high on both sides. The sky dimmed again as clouds thickened, threatening another storm. I kept one hand tight on the wheel and the other braced on the dashboard. Just a few more miles, I told myself. Just get to the main road. But the forest had other plans. Halfway down the road, the van jerked violently as if I had hit something. I slammed the brakes, my chest snapping forward. The engine sputtered and rattled in protest. I threw the van into park and stepped outside to see what I'd run over. There was nothing in front of me. No rock, no branch, no fallen tree limb. But behind me, my heartbeat stuttered. A single footprint pressed into the center of the road behind the van. One print, deep, heavy, facing toward me, the exact same imprint pattern as the deeper tracks near the campsite. I spun, scanning the trees, flashlight beam jittering as my hands shook again. Snowflakes began to fall, soft at first, then thicker. Each flake felt loud in the silence. Then, somewhere deep within the forest, a sound echoed, a long, slow exhale. Human, but not quite. I didn't wait. I sprinted back to the van, threw the door shut, and jammed my foot onto the gas. The tires spun, caught, and hurled me down the road. I kept glancing into the mirrors, half expecting to see a tall figure emerging through the snow behind me. But the forest remained still. The snowfall intensified, turning the world into a white blur. I leaned forward over the wheel, squinting, every muscle tense. A few minutes later, the road widened, the trees thinned, and finally, the first sign of plowed pavement appeared. My grip on the steering wheel loosened only when I reached the main road where the snow was flattened and other vehicles had passed in the last day. Only then did I let myself breathe. Not fully, but enough. I pulled over at a turnout, engine idling. My breath shook as I exhaled into the quiet. I turned off the heater, listening to the tick of cooling metal inside the van. Snow tapped softly on the windshield, and in that stillness, something dawned on me with unnerving clarity. Those footprints that led toward my van, the ones with no return trail. They hadn't vanished. They hadn't disappeared. They'd been erased, covered, smoothed out by something that didn't want me to know where it went or where it stayed. A tremor ran through me as I replayed the night over and over, the tapping, the dragging hand, the silhouette, the two separate sets of footprints, the heavy impressions behind where I'd stood, the single print on the road. None of it felt random, none of it felt human. But the deeper fear wasn't about what I saw, it was about what I didn't. Something had come to that campground. Something had walked right up to my van. Something had watched me breathe in my sleep. And something had followed me, if only for a few steps when I left. I sat there in the turnout, staring at the forest line in the distance, the sky above it darkening with a new wave of snow. The storm rolled in heavy and fast, swallowing the ridge until it looked like the world was dissolving into white. And in that dissolving silence, something surprising filled my chest. Not just fear, not just relief, but a strange, sobering understanding. Sometimes the things that chase us aren't meant to catch us. Sometimes they exist to remind us that we are still alive, that our instincts matter, that our choices matter, that danger can wake us up in ways comfort never will. The forest didn't feel like an enemy. Not anymore. It felt like something ancient, something indifferent, something that had simply shown me a truth I needed to face. I had been sleepwalking through my own life. Numb, detached, drifting. The cold, the isolation, the presence in the woods, they carved something open inside me. Not to hurt me, but to shake me awake. I turned the key again. The engine hummed, quieter now, steady. I gripped the wheel, feeling the warmth returning to my fingers. The road stretched ahead, long and white and waiting. As I pulled back onto the asphalt, snow swirling in the headlights, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of direction, a sense of purpose, a sense of being unmistakably, terrifyingly alive. And as the forest slipped behind me, I carried one final thought. Survival doesn't always mean defeating what hunts you. Sometimes it means finally listening to the voice inside you that whispers, "Move, wake up, live." Courage flickered. Not bravery exactly, more like a stubborn refusal to be toyed with. I grabbed my boots, quietly unzipped the sleeping bag, and prepared myself for the cold blast that would hit the moment I cracked open the sliding door. I wasn't going out to confront anything. I wasn't that reckless. I just needed to check the area, maybe get a sense of whether the tracks led anywhere now that some time had passed. The cold slapped me as soon as the door slid open. My breath turned into a thick cloud. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I stepped into the dark. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the night, illuminating the untouched surface of the camp loop. The footprints were still there beside the van. Still no trail leading away. I turned the light toward the tree line. Snow glittered like crushed glass under the beam, but no fresh impressions broke its surface. Whoever had been outside was gone, but they hadn't left in any direction I could see. A branch cracked somewhere deeper in the woods. My head snapped toward the sound, but the trees were tall enough and thick enough to swallow the light. My imagination started filling the gaps with shapes that weren't there. Figures that moved when I wasn't looking. Faces peeking from behind trunks. I forced myself to take one slow, deep breath. Then another. The cold started burning my fingers through my gloves. I knew I couldn't stay out long, not if I wanted to keep them working. I circled back toward the van, rail-thin shadows stretching across the snow as the flashlight shook in my hand. Just before I slid the door closed, I took one last look toward the trees, and something caught my eye. Far back, almost to the ridge, a dark silhouette stood between two pines. It wasn't moving. It was just there. Tall, thin, unnaturally straight. Its head didn't tilt or turn toward me. It simply faced my direction, though I couldn't make out features from that distance. My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to get inside. I didn't hesitate. I slid the door shut and locked it with trembling fingers. Then I shut off the flashlight and curled back into my sleeping bag, trying to slow the pounding in my chest. I stayed awake until the faintest hint of dawn bled into the sky, listening, waiting, expecting the silhouette to return. When daylight finally arrived, I felt a small hit of relief until I checked the tree line again. The silhouette was gone. I stepped outside once more, driven by a mix of fear and urgency. The air stung bitterly, colder than the night before. The sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. I scanned the entire ridgeline, the dense forest beyond, and every tree that could have hidden a figure. But what I saw next made every muscle in my body lock up. New footprints, leading from the tree line directly toward my van, not wandering, not circling, a straight, deliberate path, as if the figure had waited for sunrise before approaching. But what made my stomach drop was this. The prints didn't match the first set. These weren't small, inconsistent steps. They were longer, heavier, a different person, a different pattern entirely. Two separate sets of tracks. Two separate visitors, both coming toward me, both with no tracks leading away. And as I stared at those prints in the cold morning light, one detail made the fear settle into something deeper, something more primal. Each step was pressed unnaturally deep, as if whoever made them was carrying more weight than a human should, or pressing down harder, or sinking into the snow in a way that didn't match normal anatomy, like something walked with purpose, or leaned forward, or... I swallowed, lurched. I backed up toward the van, feeling a tremor start in my hands. The silence of the forest felt different again. Not empty, not still, but aware. Like it was waiting for me to understand something I wasn't ready to see. I didn't pack up immediately. Part of me didn't want to move at all, didn't want to draw attention, didn't want to signal fear. I thought about leaving right then, but a deeper instinct gnawed at me. Something wasn't done yet. Something had begun in the night that wasn't going to let me just drive away. The footprints, 2 sets, 2 strangers, 2 impossible trails, all leading to me. I stood there staring down at them, the bitter cold burning my face, when I realized something that made my blood run even colder. One of the sets of prints stopped less than 3 feet behind where I'd been standing, and the snow behind me had no other impressions. Whoever stood there stood silently, watching me while I slept. Just say continue when you're... For a long moment, I couldn't move. The cold bit so sharply into my cheeks that it almost felt warm, like a flush of heat rising through frozen skin. I kept staring at that final footprint behind me, the one that ended abruptly, as if the person who made it had stepped directly behind where I stood and simply stopped existing. My breath came faster, fogging the air in short bursts. I forced myself to step backward toward the van, eyes never leaving the prints. The forest remained silent, too silent, holding its breath the same way I was. The sunlight, filtering through the clouds, sharpened every shadow until the whole world looked carved from cold steel. Inside the Westphalia, I slammed the sliding door shut, locked it, then locked it again, like the second lock would matter. I sat on the edge of the bench seat, staring at my own hands as they shook. Not from the cold, not anymore. Fear had settled deep into my bones, refusing to thaw. I told myself to think logically, to evaluate, to plan, to prepare, but my thoughts spun in circles, tripping over each other. 2 sets of prints, 2 visitors, no departures, a figure between the trees. A dragging hand across the metal, footsteps circling the van. No explanations that fit inside what I believed about the world. But one instinct rose through the chaos, cutting through everything. I needed to leave. I needed to get out while the daylight still held, before whatever had been watching chose to come closer again. I turned the ignition. The Westphalia coughed, sputtered, hesitated in the cold, but finally groaned awake. The engine's low, uneven rumble filled the cabin. It was the most comforting sound I'd heard in hours. I exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. I didn't even bother securing half my gear. I just threw what I could into the back and prepared to drive away from the campground and whatever waited in those trees. But when the tires rolled forward, they slipped. Not much, just enough to jolt the van sideways. The rear wheels weren't grabbing the snow. I backed up, trying to reposition. Another slip. My stomach dropped. I stepped outside again, boots crunching hard on the icy surface, and moved to check the tires. The air hit me like a slap. The deeper cold of early morning, dry, razor-sharp, bit through my clothes instantly. But the cold wasn't what froze me. The rear tires were sunk deeper than they should have been, not stuck, but pressed down, as if something heavy had stood or leaned on the back of the van during the night, compacting the snow beneath the frame. I crouched slowly, feeling every pulse in my body. The snow under the tire was forced hard-packed, almost sculpted, pressed down deeper than my weight could ever have made. Something had been back here. Something heavy. Something tall enough to drag its fingers across the sliding door, lean its weight onto the engine bay, and watch me through the window. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath as I climbed back into the driver's seat. I eased off the clutch, feathered the gas, and let the van inch forward in tiny movements, coaxing the tires to catch. I didn't turn around. Every instinct screamed to, but something deeper, something older, kept me frozen. It was the same kind of instinct animals use when they sense a predator behind them. That stillness, that refusal to move even a fraction of an inch, the kind that comes from somewhere survival is carved into bone. The breathing behind me was soft at first, barely more than a shift of air. But it was too controlled, too steady to be an animal that had snuck in. And I knew my van. Every creak, every hinge, every sound that belonged and every sound that didn't. This breathing didn't belong. It had weight. It had intention. Outside, the figure still pointed toward me, its arms stiff, its posture unnatural, like it was holding itself up more than standing. The lantern light made it a silhouette without details, a shadow wearing the shape of a person. But something about its proportions was off. Shoulders too narrow, arms too long, head tilted too far forward, as if it were studying something incredibly small. My throat tightened. I swallowed hard. The breathing behind me deepened, like whoever, whatever, was back there thought I might finally turn and acknowledge it. Instead, I kept my eyes on the figure outside. I slowly reached for the van keys. They were lying in the cup holder. My fingertips grazed them. The slight jingle of metal sounded deafening in the silence. When the keys moved, the breathing behind me stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Completely. Like whoever was back there was holding their breath now, too. And then something brushed the back of my seat, a fingertip or a knuckle. Soft. Testing the boundary. A shiver tore down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to force my lungs to move. Outside, the figure lowered its arm. It didn't walk away. It didn't come closer. It simply dropped the gesture, like a teacher disappointed a student didn't follow directions. That somehow terrified me more than anything else. Finally, I forced myself to move. Slow, deliberate. I slid the keys from the cup holder into the ignition. The tiny click echoed through the van like a gunshot. Outside, the silhouette twitched. Inside, the breathing behind me started again, but this time it was close. Too close, as if a mouth hovered inches from the back of my neck. I turned the key. The engine coughed. Again, once, twice. A sick, dragging sound rattled through the van's frame, like the desert itself was holding the engine back. The figure outside tilted its head farther, almost perpendicular. The breathing behind me grew raspy, anticipatory. I slammed my palm against the steering column and turned the key one more time. The engine roared to life. Everything happened at once. The breathing exploded into a guttural exhale. My rearview mirror fogged instantly, like someone had pressed their full face against it. The silhouette outside jerked backward as if the noise physically struck it. And somewhere beneath the van, something scraped violently against the metal frame. A fast, frantic, dragging sound, as though whatever was under there suddenly panicked. I didn't stay to understand any of it. I threw the van into gear, spun the wheel, and peeled off the dusty pullout so hard gravel sprayed in an arc behind me. The headlights cut through the dark, catching glimpses of the ghost town as I passed it. Shattered windows illuminated like glowing eyes, collapsed doors slamming shut in the wind that hadn't existed moments before. But the figure was gone. It didn't run. It didn't dissolve into shadow. It was simply not there anymore. The road ahead stretched into darkness. My tires fishtailed on loose dirt, and I gripped the wheel with both hands, forcing myself to focus. Adrenaline blurred the edges of the world. Every bump felt like hands slamming against the undercarriage. Every flick of shadow felt like someone sprinting beside the van. After a few miles, I risked a glance at the rearview mirror. The fog on the glass hadn't faded, and there, drawn with a fingertip in the condensation, was a single word: stay. My chest tightened so hard it felt like something inside me might collapse. I wiped the mirror with the back of my hand so aggressively I nearly cracked it. But the moment I cleared the glass, something shone in the distance behind me. Headlights. Bright, steady, unmoving. I wasn't sure if they were following me or just watching me leave. Neither option made sense out here. I kept driving. Desert roads don't offer much comfort. No guardrails, no houses, no landmarks, just blackness stretching in every direction. The van rattled over washboards in the dirt, every vibration making it harder to tell what sounds belong to the road and what sounds belong to something else. After a long while, the desert temperature plunged. Cold leaked in through the vents like it was being forced inside. My breath started fogging in the cabin. That didn't make sense either. Nights get cold, sure, but they don't flash freeze out of nowhere. I tightened my jacket around me. That's when I smelled it again, that same metallic, sweet scent, the one from earlier, like burnt mesquite and electricity. It poured in through the vents, thick enough to taste. My stomach churned. I slowed the van on instinct. The headlights behind me vanished instantly. Not faded, not turned, vanished, as if whoever drove them simply extinguished the world around them. I sat there with the engine idling, staring into the mirror. My pulse hammered through my skull. That smell grew stronger, filling every inch of my lungs. Without thinking, I reached to shut the vent and froze, because the air blowing out wasn't just cold, it was warm, in pulses, like breath, slow, rhythmic, intentional, coming from inside the ventilation system. My fingers trembled as I pushed the vent shut. The warm pulses stopped immediately, but the smell lingered, hanging thick in the cabin. I gripped the wheel again and decided I wasn't stopping for anything. Not until I reached a highway, a gas station, a town, anything with people. The desert swallowed the road ahead, and for a long while it was just me, the van's humming engine, and that creeping sense that something was pacing me just beyond the reach of the headlights. Finally, a faded sign appeared, illuminated in the high beams. Ravenholt, 6 miles. I'd never heard of Ravenholt. It wasn't on my GPS. It wasn't on any map I used planning the trip. But right now, the idea of lights, walls, voices, anything pulled me toward it. The road straightened, and soon a cluster of dim lights shimmered against the horizon. Not bright, not inviting, but human, at least. The outlines of small buildings appeared first, a diner, an old church, a boarded-up gas station, a motel with half its letters missing. But the town felt wrong. Not abandoned, exactly, just paused. Like everything had stopped mid-motion and was waiting for permission to continue. As I rolled into the main street, something shifted in me, a prickling sensation down my arms. The same instinct I felt earlier, the one telling me something wasn't just watching me, something was expecting me. Most windows in Ravenholt were dark, but as I passed a narrow alley between 2 old brick buildings, I saw something move in the shadows. A silhouette. Small. Still, facing the street. I drove faster, pretending I didn't see it, pretending it wasn't turning its head in one slow, unnatural arc as I passed, tracking me with a shape where a face should have been. Up ahead, the diner glowed faintly, warm yellow leaking through the windows. It was the only place in town that looked alive. I pulled into the parking lot and shut off the engine. My hands shook so hard I had to grip my wrists to steady them. But the moment the engine died, I heard it. That same tapping sound from earlier. Not on the van. Not from behind me. From the diner. Tap, 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 tap. Like a code, like someone signaling. And when I looked up through the fogged window of the diner, I saw a man sitting in the corner booth, staring directly at me. He mouthed something I couldn't hear, but I knew what he said. You shouldn't have come here. For a long moment, I didn't move. I stayed inside the van with my hands braced against the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the man in the diner window. He didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't even pretend he wasn't staring. He just watched me the way someone watches a storm building in the distance, knowing exactly when it's going to break. A warm gust of air rolled through the parking lot, carrying dust that swirled under the streetlights like smoke. The town around me didn't stir. No doors opened, no curtains twitched. Even the neon motel sign didn't buzz the way old neon should. The stillness pressed against my skull, the way the desert had pressed against me earlier. But here, it felt directed, focused, like the town was holding its breath, waiting to see what choice I'd make. Finally, I forced myself out of the van. My legs felt stiff, like they belonged to someone who'd been sitting for years, not seconds. The night air was colder than it should have been for a desert town. It carried a faint metallic tang that made the hairs on my forearms lift. As I walked toward the diner, gravel crunching beneath my boots, the tapping sound grew louder. Tap, 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 tap. The sound wasn't random. It had rhythm, pattern, and the closer I got to the diner door, the more I realized it wasn't echoing from the building. It was coming from inside my chest, my heartbeat, matching the exact cadence of the taps. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. A bell above it jingled, but the sound felt flat, muted, that like it was being swallowed by the walls before it even had a chance to ring out. The diner was almost empty. A woman behind the counter pretended to wipe a mug that was already spotless. An older man sat at the far end of the counter, staring into a bowl of soup with the blankness of someone trying not to think too loudly. And there, in the corner booth, sat the man who'd mouthed the warning. He didn't wave me over, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge me in any normal sense. He just kept his eyes on me. I slid into the booth across from him. The seat was cold, like someone had stored it in a freezer before bolting it back to the floor. Up close, the man looked younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, but with the kind of exhaustion that deepens the lines around someone's eyes. His clothes were dusty, his hair wild, his fingers tapping the tabletop in a slow, repetitive pattern. That same pattern. Tap, 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 tap. "Why did you follow the road here?" he finally asked, his voice low, the kind that carries warning without raising volume. "I didn't follow anything," I said. "I was trying to leave whatever I saw back at the campground." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Nobody comes to Ravenholt unless something wants them here. And once you're in, you're in." My pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" The man didn't answer right away. He slid his gaze toward the window, that's the same one he'd watched me through. "Did you see them yet?" he asked. "Who?" He turned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "The townspeople." A chill crawled up my spine. "I saw someone in an alley." "Not people," he said softly. "Not really. Not anymore." The woman behind the counter paused mid-wipe, her back stiffening slightly. The old man at the counter didn't move at all. "They look like us," the man continued. "They walk like us, but they don't breathe. They don't blink. They don't think. They just wait." "For what?" I asked. "For whoever gets brought here next." Something in the diner's fluorescent lights flickered. Once, twice. My eyes drifted up instinctively, but the man snapped his fingers to get my attention. "Don't look at the lights," he hissed. "Don't ever look at the lights in this town." My heart thudded against my ribs. "Why not?" "Because that's how they see you." The lights buzzed again, louder this time, see like the entire electrical system was inhaling. The woman behind the counter froze mid-motion. The man at the counter's spoon hovered inches above his bowl. The lights didn't flicker normally. They strobed, fast, violent, almost panicked, and each time they flashed, shadows stretched in the corners of the diner like something invisible was crawling just beneath the surface. And then, without warning, the lights cut out. Complete darkness swallowed the room. I heard movement. Slow, dragging, deliberate, and my breath caught in my throat. The man across from me grabbed my wrist under the table, squeezing hard enough to bruise. His voice came out as harsh whisper inches from me. "Don't move. Don't talk. Don't breathe too loud." Something shuffled near the counter. A soft scrape of shoes. Then another. And then two more. The sound of bodies turning, angling, sensing. In the pitch dark, I could feel the presence of others in the diner. More than just the two who'd been inside when I walked in. Much more. My lungs screamed for air, but I forced myself to inhale slowly, evenly, controlling the sound. The darkness felt thick, pressing against my eyes, against my tongue, against the inside of my skull. Then, faint but unmistakable, a whisper threaded through the room. Not words, just breath. Close. So close I felt it brush the back of my hair. I flinched. The man across from me squeezed my wrist harder, warning me without speaking. The whisper shifted directions. Something wet dragged across the floor. Something touched the booth seat beside me, the lightest brush of fabric, but enough to jolt a tremor through my leg. A low hum rolled through the diner, vibrating through the metal fixtures. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't electrical, it was voices. Layered, disjointed, breathing in unison, searching. Then the lights snapped back on. The diner was empty, the counter, the booths. The doorway, empty, except for me and the man across from me. His grip finally loosened. "That was a sweep," he whispered. "They check for anything new, anything out of place." "And they didn't find us?" I asked. "Not this time," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand. But that won't last. They know something came into town tonight. They can smell it. What are they? I ask. He didn't answer at first. His eyes drifted toward the window again, this toward the empty street outside. People who stayed too long, he said at last. People who looked at the lights. People who breathed the wrong air in the wrong place. The desert doesn't bury ghosts, it repurposes them. A chill rippled through me. How do I leave? I asked. The man leaned forward, dropping his voice to a near-silent rasp. You don't, he said, not unless the town lets you. A hard swallow scraped down my throat. And what if it doesn't? He held my gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then you become part of it. Something outside slammed. A door, a shutter, a body. It echoed through the diner like a thunderclap. The man jumped to his feet. They're closing in. We need to move. Now. I followed him out of the booth, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The diner door creaked as he cracked it open just enough to scan the street. Everything looked the same. Still, silent, waiting. Go to your van, he whispered. Start it fast. Don't look at anything. Don't stop for anything. And you? I asked. He didn't answer. Didn't even look back at me. He just stepped into the street and vanished into an alley like he'd never been there at all. I turned toward my van and froze. Something was standing behind it, tall, still, facing me. And this time, it moved. It took a second for my brain to understand the movement, not because it was fast, but because it was wrong. The figure didn't step or sway like a person. It unfolded like its limbs had been tucked tightly against its body and were now stretching into a shape they were still learning how to inhabit. Shoulders rising too high, head tilting too far, arms extending in slow, deliberate arcs. A cold pulse shuddered through me, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. The figure stood in the glow of the diner light, tall enough that its shadow dragged across the pavement and touched the front tires of my van. It faced me with a stillness that wasn't natural, like it didn't need to breathe or blink or exist in the same rhythm as everything else in the world. My hand drifted toward my pocket, feeling for the van keys. The figure cocked its head. Left. Right. Left again. The movement was slow, curious, almost studious, the way someone examines a shape they've seen before but never understood. My stomach twisted. The tapping pattern returned, echoing faintly inside my chest. That same unnatural rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. Except this time, the sound wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the figure. Its arm rose, long, too long, and it tapped its knuckles against its own ribcage in perfect sequence. Tap, 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 tap. As if it was answering a question I hadn't asked. The muscles in my legs tensed. Instinct screamed at me to run, to get in the van, to peel out of Ravenholt without looking back. But something deeper kept me rooted to the pavement. A terrible magnetic stillness. Then the figure took a step toward me. One step. And the entire street seemed to react at once. Windows darkened. Shadows and alleyways elongated. The wind shifted direction, sweeping dust across the road in spirals that moved too fast, too intelligently, as if something invisible was sprinting just beneath the surface. I took a step back. The figure responded immediately, taking another step forward, mirroring me, matching my distance like we were tethered. I forced my lungs to work. Stay back. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. The figure snapped its head upright, as if it recognized language, not the meaning, just the sound, and its torso leaned forward, stretching in a sinewy arc that made my spine lock. A warped voice spilled out, distorted and hollow, like someone trying to speak through water. Stay. Back. It wasn't repeating my words. It was mimicking the shape of them, like a child tracing letters without knowing their meaning. My fingers closed around the van keys in my pocket. I moved fast, not a sprint, just a single decisive pivot, and the figure lunged. Not toward me, beside me. It landed inches from where I'd been standing, its arms scraping against the road as it steadied itself, joints bending at angles that made a sharp pain shoot through my jaw. The movement was fast, no, impossible, like it had momentarily forgotten gravity existed. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I ran. My boots hammered the pavement as I sprinted toward the van. The key fob slipped in my fingers, and for a terrifying second, I thought I'd drop it. The shadow behind me shifted, elongated, stretched toward me like something reaching with anticipation. I slammed into the driver's door, ripped it open, and dove inside. My knee cracked against the console, sending a burst of pain up my thigh. I jammed the keys into the ignition. The van hesitated. My pulse skyrocketed. Come on. The engine roared to life. The moment it did, something slammed against the back of the van. A thunderous, bone-deep impact that rocked the entire frame. I screamed without meaning to, jerking the wheel as I threw the van into gear. The tires spun on loose gravel for a heartbeat, then caught. I shot forward. In the rearview mirror, something clung to the back door. A shape, long and dark, its limbs spread wider than a person's should. As the van accelerated, its fingers dug into the metal, leaving deep scratches. Its face, or what I thought was its face, pressed against the rear window. Its mouth was too wide, its teeth too long, and its eyes were hollow. Not black, not empty. Hollow, like someone had carved out the space where sight should have been. I swerved hard left. The creature's grip broke. It slid across the asphalt, limbs thudding against the pavement as it tumbled unnaturally. But instead of stopping, it spilled upward, like the ground was merely an optional direction. It rose into a crouch, head twisting toward me as if listening to a sound only it could hear. I didn't look back again. I tore down Ravenholt's main street, passing the boarded-up motel, the dark church, the gas station frozen in time. Every building watched me with windows that felt like eyes. The sky above the town flickered. Once, twice, with a faint, unnatural glow, like the horizon was being lit by a distant electrical crackle. And then I hit the edge of town. The welcome sign blurred past. I expected relief, a sense of escape. But instead, the road ended. Not in a curve, not in a T-junction. It simply stopped. 1 second there was pavement beneath my wheels. The next, nothing but open desert stretching into an impossible blankness. I slammed the brakes. The van skidded sideways, kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed the headlights in a choking fog. My chest slammed into the seatbelt. The world spun in a violent arc before the van shuddered to a stop, engine rattling. I gasped, gripping the steering wheel with shaking hands. Ahead of me was flat, empty desert. No road, no markers, no path leading out. I'd driven straight to the edge of Ravenholt, and the world simply didn't exist past it. A cold terror gripped the base of my spine. Behind me, in the settling dust, I saw movement, the shape of something rising, unfolding, advancing slowly, not in a rush, because it didn't need to rush. I threw the van into reverse, heart thundering. The engine groaned as I accelerated backward, tires fishtailing as the van struggled to keep traction. The creature stepped into the glow of the taillights. Its limbs twitched, its head crooked, its torso expanded unnaturally, like it was inhaling. The van lurched backward onto pavement again. I spun the wheel, pulling a sloppy U-turn that nearly tipped the van onto two wheels. I felt the weight shift violently, then stabilize. I didn't care where the road led anymore. I just drove. Streetlights flickered violently overhead as I raced back through Ravenholt. Shadows moved between buildings, fast, liquid shapes that didn't match human silhouettes. Windows pulsed with faint light rhythmically, like the whole town was breathing in unison. I passed the diner. The door was open. Inside, figures stood shoulder to shoulder, too close, too still, too identical, all facing the street, all facing me. Their necks tilted in the same impossible angle, their mouths opened in unison, not in scream, but in inhalation. As if they were tasting the air, tasting me. I floored the accelerator. The van roared out of town, back onto the long stretch of road that had led me there. For miles, I didn't see movement, didn't hear breathing, didn't smell that metallic tang, only darkness, only distance, only desert. Finally, mercifully, a green highway sign appeared ahead. US 95 North, 12 miles. 12 miles. I could make 12 miles. My breath shook as I tightened my grip on the wheel. And then a tapping started. Soft, inside the dashboard. Tap, 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 tap. From directly behind the vents, and a voice, quiet, hollow, too close, whispered my name. Marcus. For a second, I genuinely thought my heart stopped. The whispering voice was so close it felt like it had formed inside my lungs, not in the air around me. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my imagination. It knew my name, and it spoke it with the wrong kind of familiarity, like someone who'd never met me but had memorized the shape of the word. My hands slipped on the steering wheel. I wiped my palms on my jeans, trying to catch a full breath. Marcus. The voice came again, a bare exhale wrapped in syllables. I glanced at the dashboard vent. The plastic slats trembled, not with breeze, but with pressure, as if something was trying to push through from the inside. My entire body locked. The tapping resumed. Tap, 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 tap. A rhythm I would have sworn belonged to the ghost town, the figure, the shadows, but it was here now, inside my van, like the sound had followed me the way a scent clings to clothing after smoke. No, I whispered, voice cracking. No, no, no. The van's engine strained as I pushed the accelerator harder. The needle climbed. The desert road blurred. But the tapping continued, louder now, more insistent, like it was matching the van's speed, like it was getting excited. And then the vent exhaled. Not air. Warmth. A warm, damp breath pushed through the plastic slats and spread across my hands gripping the wheel. I jerked away, nearly sending the van off the road. The tires bit gravel, skidded, then caught again. My pulse shot up so fast I felt lightheaded. I forced myself to glance at the vent. Something looked back. Not eyes, not a face, but a suggestion of shape, like someone exhaling against frosted glass from the other side. A blur of condensation intensified, as though lips were pressed just behind the vent's grill. Marcus. The whisper dragged out longer, softer, almost coaxing. I slammed the vent closed with the side of my fist. The tapping stopped instantly, replaced by a low hum like distant vibration against metal. I didn't wait for it to evolve into something worse. The van shot forward through the desert night, the headlights carving a narrow path in a world that felt bigger and emptier than it had any right to be. My mind raced ahead faster than the engine. Highway 95. Civilization. Light. People. Anything that wasn't Ravenholt. Just 12 miles. 11. 10. At mile marker 104, something crossed the road. A flicker of movement. A flash of shadow. A shape on all fours but not crawling. Gliding. My body reacted before my brain could. I slammed the brakes, the tires screamed. The van fish-tailed sideways, throwing me against the seatbelt so hard a shock ripped through my ribs. Dust exploded around the headlights and turned the night into fogged gold. The shape was gone. I sat there gasping, fingers trembling, sweat soaking the back of my shirt. A hollow knock tapped the passenger window. Tap, 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 tap. I froze. Slowly, because I couldn't not, I turned my head. A face hovered inches from the glass. But it wasn't the creature from the town. It was the man from the diner. Except his features were wrong now, stretched, elongated, softened like wax held too close to a flame. His eyes glowed faintly, not with color but with reflection, as though lit by something inside him instead of outside. His mouth opened slowly. No breath fogged the window. He wasn't breathing. I reached for the gear shift, but he lifted a finger and tapped the glass again, slower this time. A warning. A plea. Maybe both. I cracked the window an inch. I don't know why. Maybe because he'd helped me survive the diner. Maybe because I needed to believe something human still existed in all this. Or maybe because some part of me felt I owed him at least one moment of trust. His voice spilled through the crack. Soft, thin, frayed at the edges. They're following you. My breath hitched. I know. He shook his head. The movement looked wrong, like the bones inside were no longer aligned. No, he whispered. Not them. He pressed his palm to the glass. You brought something with you. A tremor slid down my spine, cold as water. From Ravenholt, his eyes rolled slightly like he was fighting something inside himself. No, he rasped. Before that, when you stopped at the creek bed, when you saw the footprints. My pulse faltered. That was the first one, he whispered. It touched your van. It marked you. My lips parted, but no sound came out. You breathe their air now, he said. They can find you anywhere. The tapping sound echoed again, but not from him, from inside the van. Behind me. Close, too close. The man's distorted face twitched. He recoiled from the window like something burned him. "I can't stay," he forced out. "I'm not supposed to talk to you." They notice when one of us breaks pattern. His head jerked violently, shoulders convulsing. "Go," he croaked. Now, before they. His words cut off, not because he stopped speaking, but because his entire body froze in place. Every muscle locked. His jaw hung open, eyes wide and empty, fingers splayed against the glass, unmoving, like someone pressed pause on him mid-breath. A thin filament of shadow slid behind him. For a heartbeat, I saw the shape, not tall, not crawling, not any single form I recognized. It was movement made solid, a silhouette that rippled as if the night sky itself had draped over a trembling shape beneath. It hovered behind him, inches from the back of his neck, and then he was gone. Not pulled, not dragged, not lifted. Gone, like someone erased him from the world in one motion. A violent, ringing silence slammed into my ears. I threw the van into drive. The wheels spun. The van lurched violently forward. The tapping from inside the van intensified. Tap, 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 tap. Fast now, excited, hungry. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles went numb. The road blurred by beneath me. The air inside the van thickened, the temperature rising as though breath filled every corner, every inch, pressing against my lungs. "Get out," I whispered to myself. "Get out of the desert. Just go." The hum returned, low, vibrating through the floorboards. Something skittered beneath the driver's seat. I felt it, the faintest drag of fingernails across metal. My vision doubled. Heat flashed across my forehead. The hum swelled. "Marcus," the whisper rose from the vents, the floor, the roof, all around me. "You didn't leave us." I swerved onto the shoulder. The van jolted. I forced myself back on the road. "It's not done." My breath shook. "You can't have me," I snapped, though my voice cracked, weak, terrified. The whisper came again, softer now. "We already do." My chest tightened so violently I choked. My vision narrowed. The headlights tunneled the road into a shrinking cone of gold. And then, lights. Real lights. A gas station up ahead. Small, rundown, but real. A sign flickered above it, "Last stop fuel and snacks." I slammed into the parking lot, skidding sideways until the van shuddered to a stop beside the pumps. I threw the gear into park and stumbled out, collapsing against the hood, lungs heaving. The whispering stopped entirely. The hum faded, the tapping silenced. The van was quiet, normal. A single buzzing street lamp overhead washed everything in pale yellow. The desert night felt open again, empty in the natural way, not the predatory way. For the first time since Sparrow Road, I felt alone. Or I almost did. From the corner of my eye, I saw the van's side mirror, and in its reflection, someone was sitting in the passenger seat. I didn't move at first. I couldn't. The reflection in the van's side mirror was so sharp, so solid, it felt impossible to deny. A silhouette sitting perfectly still in my passenger seat, facing forward, its shoulders square, its head tilted the way a person sits when they're waiting for you to notice them. My throat tightened. I forced myself to turn slowly, inch by inch, toward the passenger window. Nothing. The seat was empty, the dashboard silent, the vents motionless. But the mirror still showed the silhouette sitting there. My skin crawled. I took a weak step back, eyes locked on the reflection. The shape didn't shift, didn't react. It sat upright, like a passenger who'd simply buckled in for the ride. I whispered to myself, "It's a trick of the light. You're tired. You're dehydrated." But I didn't believe a single word. The fluorescent light above me buzzed louder, flickering. Every time it dimmed, the reflection in the mirror grew sharper, clearer, as if darkness gave it definition. The shape slowly turned its head toward me in the reflection. A chill sliced straight through me. I backed up until my spine hit the gas pump. My breathing was fast and shallow, my pulse hammering inside my ears. I couldn't process it, couldn't rationalize it. My body was begging me to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. Then the gas station door swung open. The sound was simple, a bell chime. But the impact on my nerves was so sudden that my entire body jolted. A man stepped out, late 50s, sunburned skin, wearing a faded trucker hat. He looked like he belonged in every desert outpost I'd ever passed. tired, grounded, and profoundly uninterested in anything supernatural. "Pump's offline," he called to me. "Storm knocked the grid last night. If you need gas, I've got a generator running on the back tank." I didn't answer. Couldn't. The man squinted at me, taking in my expression, the sweat on my face, the way I stood stiff as iron. "You all right, son?" I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. He followed my gaze to the van, then frowned. "What is it?" I forced out a breath. "Do you see anything in the passenger seat? Like a figure?" He stared through the window for a long moment, then glanced at the mirror the way I had. "Looks empty to me." "But the mirror," I whispered. "Look at the mirror." He leaned toward it, frowning deeper, examined it, wiped it with his sleeve, looked again. "I don't see a thing." I swallowed hard. "It's right there, clear as day." He studied me with the wary patience of someone who's seen travelers unravel in the desert before. "You've been driving a long time?" "Heat can play tricks." I shook my head. "It's not the heat. Something followed me from a town called Ravenholt." Silence. The man straightened. His expression changed. Subtly, but unmistakably. The air between us tightened. He spoke quietly. "You shouldn't say that name out loud." My stomach dropped. "You know it?" His eyes shifted to the empty road behind me, scanning the desert like he expected something to be crouching out there in the lightless dunes. "Nobody knows it," he said, "but some folks feel it." He nodded toward the store's entrance. "Come inside. Don't stand out here." Every instinct said yes, but a louder one said no. Because the store wasn't real safety. Walls weren't safety. Light wasn't safety. Nothing had been safety all night. Still, I followed him in. The door chimed again. The air conditioning hummed softly, too softly. The lights flickered, though the storm he mentioned was nowhere in sight. "Sit," he said, motioning toward a plastic chair by the window. I sat. He took the seat opposite me and folded his arms. "Tell me exactly what you saw." And I did. I told him about Ravenholt. About the diner, about the man who froze like a puppet with cut strings, about the thing that erased him, about the voice in the vents, about the tapping, about the warmth of breath inside my van, about the reflection that wasn't empty. When I finished, the man didn't laugh, didn't doubt me, didn't ask for clarification. He only asked one question. "Did it say your name?" The air left my lungs. "Yes." His jaw tightened. "Then it's not following you anymore." A beat of hope rose in my chest. "It's not?" "No," he said. "If it said your name, it's already inside." My pulse stuttered. Inside. The word rattled around in my skull, hitting every nerve on the way down. "What does that mean?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just watched me, not with fear, but with a regret I didn't understand. "Things from places like that," he finally said, "don't follow you like animals. They follow you like ideas. They remember you. They wear you. They wait until you think you're safe, and then they speak with your breath." "My breath?" I whispered. "You ever wonder why it whispered? Why the tapping stopped when you left town? Why your van went quiet the moment you stepped out?" I felt cold down to the marrow. "Because," he said softly, "the moment you opened your door back in Ravenholt, it stepped inside." The light above us flickered violently. The humming of the air conditioner deepened, vibrating through the floor, up the chair legs, into my spine. "What do I do?" I whispered. "How do I get it out?" The man lowered his head. "You don't." I shot to my feet so fast the chair skidded backward. "No," I snapped. "I'm not just letting this thing ride with me for the rest of my life." He stood too, but slower, heavier. "Son," he said, "you think you're the first person to come through this place with a shadow sitting beside you? You think the desert stays empty because people don't travel anymore?" His eyes softened. "No one gets it out once it knows their name." Something in the store's back room fell, a soft, hollow thud. The man's face paled. "You need to leave," he murmured. "Right now." "What about you?" He swallowed and glanced toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the store. "They're not here for me." The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. Dark swallowed the store whole. And in that dark, tap, 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 tap. The sound came from every shelf, every wall, every corner. My chest clenched. The man grabbed my arm, shoving me toward the door. Run. Get back in your van. Drive until you see dawn. Don't stop. Don't look in the mirror, and whatever happens, his voice broke. Do not answer it. The door burst open as I pushed through, stumbling into the night. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted to the van. The tapping grew louder behind me, echoing through the store windows like dozens of hands drumming in excitement. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and slammed the gear shift into drive. As I peeled the parking lot, the whisper came again, soft right behind my ear. Marcus, let me in. My eyes burned. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I did the only thing I could. I didn't answer. I drove. I drove until the sky cracked open with sunrise, until the light spilled across the desert like a lifeline stretched thin across the horizon. And when the first rays touched the windshield, warm, real, human, the whisper finally faded. The tapping stilled. The air in the van felt mine again. But the mirror stayed dark. Something in me knows it's still there, quiet, waiting, listening. Desert towns have a way of holding on to you long after you leave them behind, and sometimes they follow. It's funny how a title like that sounds almost cinematic until you're the one living it, and gripping a steering wheel in the middle of nowhere while your breath fogs against the windshield and your instincts whisper that something out there is watching. I used to think fear had a shape, a shadow in the trees, a handprint on the glass, a noise you couldn't explain. But over time, I've learned that fear is mostly just you, facing the quiet parts of yourself under a sky too wide for comfort. And tonight, telling this story, I can still feel the weight of that sky pressing down like a memory determined not to be forgotten. My name is Evan. I'm 37, and for almost 2 decades, I've been camping out of an old Volkswagen Westfalia that's stitched together with more repairs than original parts. I bought it from a retired mechanic in Idaho who made me promise one thing before handing over the keys: never ignore a place that feels wrong. Back then, I shrugged it off. A campground was a campground, I thought. Dirt, trees, road. But the longer you wander America's wild corners, the more you understand that certain places aren't just locations. They're moods, they're intentions. And some of them want to be left alone. The first time I really learned it, was at a tiny, half-forgotten campground on the edge of northern Nevada. The kind of place that doesn't show up on maps so much as it shows up in conversations between people who want to test the edges of themselves. I wasn't looking for danger. I wasn't chasing a ghost story. I just wanted a night of quiet after a long, winding drive through desert roads that curled like dried-up riverbeds. But the moment my tires rolled onto that dusty ground, a thin, unfamiliar unease threaded through my chest. Not panic, not dread, just a subtle tightening, like a hand resting lightly on my sternum. I told myself it was the heat. The desert sun had spent the entire day turning the metal roof of my van into a skillet. Even after sunset, the air felt like someone had wrapped the world in a wool blanket. Still, something in the way the campground sat, too still, too quiet, too uninterested in my existence, bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. There were no other campers, no rangers, not even distant headlights drifting along the highway. Just a few scattered fire pits, a sagging picnic table, and a single wooden sign that read, "Coyote Run Camp. Use at your own risk." Someone had scratched out the last 3 words with a knife, but I could still make them out if I angled my flashlight just right. I told myself signs get vandalized all the time. I told myself that being alone wasn't a bad thing. I told myself a lot of things that night. But the truth was already pushing at the edge of my awareness. Something in that place felt wrong in a quiet, patient kind of way. I parked near the outer edge of the camp where the desert stretched open like an ocean of dust and sagebrush. The sky was so wide it felt like it could swallow me whole. The wind was barely there, just a soft, intermittent sigh brushing against the van. Every sound felt amplified: the click of my boots on gravel, the clatter of my stove, the shifting of metal as the Volkswagen cooled. Then came the first hint something was off. so small I might have ignored it if the night hadn't been so still. A single sharp snap from the brush behind the van. Not a twig falling. Not a rabbit darting away. It had weight to it. Purpose. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. The sound didn't repeat. But my instincts, the same ones I'd learned to trust after years on the road, stirred like someone tapping a finger against the back of my mind. You're not alone. I swallowed my dinner without tasting it and slid the van door shut, letting the familiar click settle my nerves. Inside, the space felt safer, tighter, a cocoon of metal and nostalgia. But the moment I turned off the overhead light, the darkness outside seemed to press in from every direction. My breath caught on something I couldn't name. I tried distracting myself by rearranging gear, making mental notes about maintenance I needed to do, anything to quiet the sudden jitter in my thoughts. But then another sound cut through the dark, soft, rhythmic, almost cautious. Footsteps, slow ones, but not human. Humans step with weight, heel then toe, a pattern you recognize even when you can't see the person walking. These steps had a dragging quality, like something long-legged and unsure, or something pretending to be unsure. I crawled to the back window, easing the curtain aside a centimeter. The moon hung low, swollen and yellow, bathing the desert in a washed-out glow. Nothing moved in the open space, but near the brush where the sound had come from earlier, the sage plants swayed in a way that didn't match the breeze. I told myself it was a deer, or a coyote. This was their land, after all. But a tight knot formed in my gut, a twisting unease I couldn't banish. I closed the curtain and sat back against the cupboard, listening. The night grew quiet again, unnervingly so. I tried to breathe slow, steady, deliberate breaths, but each inhale carried a thin thread of anxiety I couldn't unravel. The steps didn't return. Not right away. It wasn't until nearly an hour later, when I'd finally managed to let my muscles loosen just a little, that they came back. This time, closer, much closer. So close the van itself seemed to register each soft crunch of gravel. My heart jackhammered against my rib cage. I held my breath and pressed my ear to the metal wall. The footsteps circled the van, once, then twice, slow, deliberate measuring. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. After the third circle, everything went dead silent. No wind, no shifting gravel, not even my own heartbeat seemed willing to make a sound. Then something tapped against the sliding door. Not a knock, not claws, more like pressure, testing, the kind of touch that says, I know you're in there. Every instinct I had screamed to start the engine and drive until the road itself surrendered under my wheels. But fear pinned me in place, not the loud, panicked kind, the quiet kind. The kind that settles behind your ribs and waits. The pressure on the door eased. The footsteps moved again, softer now, drifting toward the brush. And for a moment, stupidly, I thought whatever it was had lost interest. Then I heard it breathe. A low, wet exhale that carried a smell like copper and damp earth. So faint I might have imagined it if my spine hadn't turned to ice right then and there. The breathing faded. The footsteps dragged away. And finally, the desert fell still again. I didn't sleep. Not for a minute. I sat there with both hands gripping the wheel, ready to turn the key at the first sign of anything returning. The night crawled by, thick and endless. Every sound felt like a signal. Every silence felt worse. And when dawn finally broke, painting the desert pink and gold, I stepped out of the van, shaking in a way I couldn't hide. That's when I saw them. Tracks, circling the van. But not paw prints, not hooves, not anything I recognized. 5 long impressions like fingers pressed into the dust, not grabbing, not clawing, reaching. I crouched beside those prints, the morning light washing over them in long, slanted beams that made the edges stand out sharply. 5 elongated impressions, each one nearly the length of my hand. They weren't deep. Whatever had made them wasn't heavy, but the spacing, the shape, the faint drag between them, none of it matched anything I'd ever tracked. And I've done my share of wilderness wandering. I know the shuffle of a raccoon, the prance of a deer, the neat, precise press of a coyote. These prints looked like something testing the ground, like something unfamiliar with walking upright or walking at all. My first instinct was to get the hell out of Coyote Run camp. I packed up fast, shoving gear into the van without caring where it landed. But as I grabbed the last bag from the ground, I noticed a second set of prints leading toward the brush line. Faint, barely visible in the new sunlight. They weren't circling. They were leading away, deeper into the desert, as if whatever had come up to the van in the night had returned to someplace it felt comfortable, or someplace it belonged. I stared at those tracks for longer than I should have, and torn between the sensible fear telling me to drive away and the curiosity that's gotten me into more trouble than I care to admit. There's something about fear that sharpens your attention, makes every detail feel like it carries weight. And part of me, the reckless part that used to believe the world was made of puzzles to solve, wanted to know what had walked around my van. But sense won out. I slammed the van door shut, started the engine, and pulled out of that campground so fast, dust chased me down the road like a warning. I didn't stop driving until I reached a highway turnout 50 miles east. There was a small rest area with 2 picnic tables and a water spigot that dripped steadily like it had been crying for years. I parked and let the engine idle down, my hands still trembling a little. The desert out here was different, more open, less suffocating. But the feeling in my chest hadn't entirely faded. Something from that night clung to me, like a scent that wouldn't wash off. As I stood beside the van, stretching my legs, an older man in a sun-faded fishing vest strolled over from the opposite table. He had the kind of face carved by years outdoors, deep-set eyes, a beard that looked like it had never fully decided on a color. He held a thermos the size of his forearm and nodded toward me like we were already familiar. "Rough night out there?" he said, voice gravelly, amused. I stiffened. "Did I look that shaken?" He gestured behind him, vaguely in the direction of the back roads I'd come from. That whole area'll rattle your nerves if you're not used to it. Folks think empty places are safe places. They aren't. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something in his tone made my pulse flicker. "You ever camp near Coyote Run?" He paused mid-sip, thermos hovering. Then he lowered it slowly. "You went out there?" I nodded. His eyes didn't widen. He didn't gasp, but something tightened in his expression like he'd just remembered something he didn't want to. With a sigh, he leaned against the table and stared off into the horizon. "I haven't heard that name spoken in a while." "What is it? What's wrong with it?" He hesitated. Once, twice. Then, "Most folks assume it's named after actual coyotes. That's how places get marked on maps. Person hears an animal, names the land after it. But that wasn't how Coyote Run got its name." He glanced at me again, as if deciding whether I could handle what he was about to say. "You ever hear Navajo stories? About the tricksters, the shapeshifters, things that can wear the shape of something they're not?" I swallowed hard. The tracks flashed in my mind. He continued. "Old-timers used to claim there was something out in that desert long before roads or picnic tables or campers. Not a spirit, not exactly, but something that watched travelers, followed them, tested them, didn't always show itself, but when it didn't show a shape you'd recognize." His words settled over me like a shadow. I told him about the footsteps, about the circling, about the tapping on the van door. I didn't describe the smell. I didn't want to remember it that clearly. When I mentioned the prints, he exhaled, long and slow. "Yeah, that sounds like the stories." But stories didn't circle my van, I wanted to say. Stories didn't breathe against my door. Stories didn't leave hand-like impressions in the dirt. Instead, I said, "What does it want?" The old man shook his head. "Not sure it wants anything. But the folks who went missing out there, they had one thing in common." My throat tightened. "What?" He looked at me with a steady, measuring gaze. "They ignored their first instinct, every one of them. They felt something wrong, pushed it down, and stayed anyway." His words hit me like a punch to the ribs. Because he was right, I had felt something wrong. The moment I stepped out of the van, the moment I heard that first snap in the brush, even before the footsteps began. But I stayed. "Maybe it was just the heat," I said weakly, trying to sound casual. He snorted. Son, in the desert, instincts will save your life long before logic does. The conversation left me more unsettled than comforted. I thanked him and returned to the van, suddenly more aware of the way the world seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, as if anything, absolutely anything, could be hiding out there, just beneath the horizon line. I drove into town a few hours later, found a small diner with flickering neon and a gravel parking lot. The Volkswagen rattled as I pulled in. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that one night of strange noises and weird prints didn't mean anything supernatural. People told stories. Stories grew into legends. Legends grew into warnings. But that afternoon, sitting inside the diner with cold air blasting the sweat off my skin, I caught something in the reflection of the window that made my blood freeze. At first, I thought it was just the warped mirror of sunlight bending off the van's roof. But then I realized what I was seeing. Across the street, in a narrow alleyway between two closed shops, stood a shape, too tall for a coyote, too narrow for a person, still as a telephone pole. I blinked, and it shifted. Not stepping forward, more like leaning, adjusting itself the way someone might adjust their balance after standing too long. My heart hammered. I turned to look directly, but the angle from my booth was wrong. All I could see was the edge of the van and the open road beyond. When I looked back into the reflection, the alley was empty. I told myself I was imagining it. That exhaustion had tangled reality for a moment. But as I paid my bill and stepped outside, a warm gust of wind carried a faint scent across the lot. Copper. Damp earth. My stomach dropped. I got into the van, slammed the door, and pulled out of the lot fast enough to make gravel spit out behind me. The whole drive out of town, I felt something pressing at the back of my mind. A presence, a memory, a sense that the desert hadn't finished with me yet. When I finally reached a well-populated campground near the southern border of Oregon, I should have felt safe. People, lights, dogs barking somewhere nearby. The usual clatter of humans living their messy, noisy lives. But that night, as I lay in the back of the van listening to the hum of distant conversations and crackling campfires, a cold realization crept up my spine. Whatever had come to my van in the desert wasn't limited to the desert. Because in the middle of the night, just as sleep finally began to swallow me, something tapped on the sliding door. Once. Soft, patient, the same way it had before. And this time, when I slowly pulled the curtain back, already trembling with dread, I didn't see a shadow. I saw eyes, reflecting the faint glow of the campground lights, too high, too wide apart, too still, watching me, unblinking. Those eyes didn't blink for what felt like an eternity. They hovered in the space just beyond the thin curtain, two reflective discs catching the faint shine of a nearby lantern. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out anything but the glint of those eyes suspended in the dark. Not human. Not animal. Too still. Too deliberate. They didn't scan the campsite the way wildlife does when startled by lights or noise. They were fixed solely on me. I didn't dare move. Even the slightest shift of my breath felt like it might provoke whatever was standing there. My hand hovered over the keys in the ignition. Frozen. I couldn't decide if starting the engine would save me or trigger something I wouldn't survive. The campground around me buzzed with ordinary human life. Laughter, murmured conversations, the occasional crack of firewood. None of them knew something stood in the shadows inches from my van door, watching with the patience of stone. The longer I stared, the more something inside me unraveled. Fear does strange things when it settles in the exact center of your chest. It doesn't explode outward. It sinks in. It infiltrates. I felt it behind my ribs, inside my throat, threading its way through my bones. That same quiet voice from the desert whispered again, clearer this time. You should have left the moment you felt it. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the eyes shifted. Not away, not at first, but downward, like whatever was out there had bent slightly, lowering its perspective. And in that tiny motion, I caught the faintest outline of something impossibly thin, impossibly tall, something shaped wrong, in all the ways my mind tried not to process. It wasn't crouching like an animal. It wasn't leaning like a person. It was adjusting itself the way someone might lean toward a window to study what's inside. A soft scrape sounded against the sliding door, a whisper of friction. Skin or something like it pressing lightly against the metal. I snapped. Not out of courage, out of sheer primal terror. My hand twisted the ignition before my brain could catch up. The engine roared to life, loud enough that a couple campsite dogs started barking. The eyes vanished in a jerk, the shape pulling back into the dark so quickly it almost looked like the shadows swallowed it. In the blur of adrenaline, I threw the van into gear and floored it. I didn't look back, not once. I bounced over gravel, shot past picnic tables and tents, and tore out of that campground like I'd been given a second chance and wasn't going to question it. When I hit the main road, heart still hammering, I kept driving until civilization replaced wilderness. Gas stations, streetlights, long stretches of pavement where other people's headlights chased away the dark. But even then, I didn't stop. I couldn't. The memory of those eyes followed me like an aftertaste. By the time I reached the outskirts of a mid-sized town, the adrenaline had burned off, leaving me exhausted and shaking. I pulled into a well-lit grocery store lot, parked beneath a bright lamp, and sat there gripping the wheel. Cars came and went. People laughed, walked, argued, existed, and all I could think was, they have no idea how close the wild world presses when the lights go out. I slept there that night, engine off but windows cracked, my van under the artificial glow of halogen bulbs. Nothing came to my door. No taps, no footsteps. The night was uneventful in a way that made me wonder whether I'd imagined the entire experience. But fear leaves an imprint, a shadow in your awareness you can't wash off. And mine hadn't faded. The next morning, as I stood beside the van, stretching my cramped legs, I spotted something on the sliding door. A faint streak. Not dirt, not sap. Something greenish-black, smeared in a thin, deliberate line. When I touched it, the substance clung to my fingers with a slight tackiness, like sap mixed with oil. And the smell, subtle, earthy, metallic, hit me instantly. The same scent that drifted across my camp in the desert. Copper, damp earth. That was enough for me. I washed my hands, closed the van door, and made a decision I should have made much earlier. I went home. Not permanently, just long enough to reset, recalibrate, get back to a mental baseline that didn't involve scanning every reflection for something standing wrong in the shadows. I parked the van in my driveway for the first time in months. My neighbors asked if I'd been on another long trip. I lied and said I'd been visiting family. I didn't want to try explaining eyes that didn't blink and prints that didn't match anything in the desert guide. But even at home, something lingered. The first night back, as I lay in my own bed, the room felt different. Too quiet, too open. The walls didn't feel like walls. They felt like a thin layer separating me from something that knew I'd looked back through that curtain. I woke twice that night. Once from a dream where footsteps circled my house, once from nothing at all, the kind of sudden waking that feels like a pull more than a jolt. But nothing happened. No taps on the window, no shadows under the porch light. Just silence. For days afterward, I tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe it was an injured animal. Maybe the tracks in the dust were distorted by the wind. Maybe the eyes were a reflection of something else entirely. Fear makes patterns out of nothing. I knew that as well as anyone. But the one thing I couldn't rationalize was the smear on the van door. That substance wasn't something I'd touched in the desert. It wasn't something that dripped from trees. It didn't match oil or grease or anything mechanical. And the streak hadn't been there when I'd left Oregon. I cleaned the van thoroughly, inside and out, but even after scrubbing, a faint discoloration lingered along the metal, as if whatever had touched it had left a trace deeper than the surface. 2 weeks passed before I stepped back into the van to camp again, not in the desert this time. Not in the woods, just a calm, established campground near a quiet lake, the kind of place families bring kayaks and toddlers toss pebbles into the water. But even there, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, walked past my sight with his parents. As they passed, he glanced at my van, paused, and tugged on his mother's sleeve. "That thing touched his car," he whispered, pointing at the sliding door. My blood froze. I turned toward him, forcing a small, harmless smile. "What thing?" The boy frowned, as if trying to remember something from a dream he couldn't quite grasp. "The tall one," he said. "The one in the trees." His parents ignored it, ushering him forward, telling him not to bother strangers. He kept staring at the van, eyes narrowed in a way only children possess, that unfiltered perception adults lose over time. I didn't camp that night. I drove home again, sat in the driveway for an hour, hands shaking on the wheel. And that was when I finally understood something I'd been resisting since the desert. Some campsites aren't dangerous because of what's out there. They're dangerous because once something out there finds you, you don't choose whether it follows. You only choose whether you acknowledge it. The next morning, I wrote down everything. The footsteps, the prints, the eyes, the streak, the boy's words. Not because I needed proof, but because fear changes when it's spoken aloud. It becomes something you can trace, something with edges, something you can understand. And maybe that's why I'm telling this story now. Because danger on the road doesn't always come from cliffs, storms, or broken axles. Sometimes it comes quietly, softly, in the form of footsteps you convince yourself are harmless. Sometimes it starts as a whisper in your instincts you decide to ignore. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, it starts with a tap on the sliding door of a Volkswagen in the middle of the night, in a campsite you should never have stayed at. I still camp, I still travel. But now when I pull into a new place and something in me tightens, even a little, I listen. I trust it. I leave before the sun goes down, before the quiet settles, before whatever watches from the edges decides to learn my name. Because the thing about America's most dangerous campsites isn't the darkness or the isolation or the legends people tell. The danger is that sometimes the campsite doesn't stay behind when you drive away. Sometimes it follows. And sometimes it waits. I should have trusted that first flicker of unease when the gravel under my Volkswagen's tires turned from a familiar crunch to a softer, almost padded sound, like I'd driven onto ground that didn't want to be disturbed. It was subtle, barely noticeable beneath the low hum of the highway behind me, but it struck me as wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe it was because I'd been driving since dawn, or because the desert sun had burned the world into a bleached, humming mirage. Or maybe it was something deeper, something instinctive, the kind of quiet warning that comes from the part of your mind that remembers being prey long before you learn to pretend you were safe. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, people camped out here all the time. The place had a name in the local forums, a half-forgotten patch of BLM land just east of Beatty, where old miners used to drag carts of ore across the hills. They said the mines were abandoned, sealed, and harmless. They also said you could park overnight without anyone bothering you, as long as you kept to the designated pullouts and didn't try to pry open any federal property. That was exactly my plan. One night in the desert in the back of my Volkswagen Westphalia, a small fire, some instant ramen, a quiet sunset, and maybe a sunrise hike before heading farther north. But the road kept narrowing as I climbed into the basin. The Joshua trees grew spare and twisted, their shadows stretched long across the dirt like pointing fingers. The wind seemed to gather in pockets instead of gusting cleanly, as if moving around things I couldn't see. And the strange softness under the tires, it kept returning at random patches, unchanged no matter how slow I drove. When I finally reached the pullout, I saw only one other vehicle, a beige SUV with its windows dust-frosted and a cracked solar shower hanging from the back. A folding chair lay overturned beside it, half buried in the sand. No footprints, no people. The stillness was absolute. I parked on the opposite end, giving space, though part of me expected someone to step out, wave, maybe mention they'd been hiking, but no movement came. When I shut off the engine, the silence dropped over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to shake it off. This was exactly why I camped alone, to disconnect from noise, from schedules, from the constant sense of being observed. Out here, I could breathe. Out here, I didn't have to think about the argument I'd had with my brother last month, the one that ended with him saying I didn't know how to listen to my instincts. He wasn't wrong. I was good at rationalizing things to death, especially fear. Maybe I'd gotten too good at it. I hopped out and stretched my back, feeling the air settle around me. It smelled like sun-baked metal and dry earth, the kind of scent that hinted at places untouched for years. When the wind shifted, though, something beneath it bothered me, an undertone like old water trapped in a dark place, stale and mineral heavy. I knew that smell from hiking through abandoned structures, the scent of air that hasn't moved in forever. I turned to the hills behind camp and saw them for what they were. Not gentle slopes, but the collapsed silhouettes of old mines, their scars half camouflaged by brush and time. A few of the entrances looked sealed by rockfalls. Others were marked with rusted federal warning signs lying crooked on their posts. But one, just one, sat back farther than the rest, half shaded and darker than the shadows around it. I didn't think much of it then, not consciously. I set up my small table, made my ramen, and watched the SUV in the distance. The sun dipped low, painting the basin in colors that made the world feel suspended. Normally, sunset was my favorite time, calm, reflective, grounding. But tonight, it pressed against me differently. The air grew colder than it should have. The wind died entirely. And that smell-old, still water kept weaving through the air like a thin thread. When darkness settled, true darkness, the SUV remained lifeless. I told myself they were just sleeping early, that the overturned chair meant nothing, that the desert got silent at night, all of it rational, all of it comforting, none of it convincing. I climbed into the back of my Volkswagen, zipped the windows, and crawled into the sleeping platform with my lantern on low. The familiar interior, the warm wood paneling, the smell of old upholstery, usually grounded me. Tonight it felt too small, like the shadows outside were leaning in close, listening. My plan was to read until I got tired. Instead, I found myself staring at the thin curtain between the cabin and the rear hatch, watching it move with the slightest whisper of air, except there shouldn't have been any air moving inside. A sound drifted from outside. At first, just a soft shift of gravel, then another, too slow to be footsteps, too deliberate to be the wind. I held still, listening, telling myself it was an animal, a fox, a coyote, even a burro wandering from one of the nearby ghost towns. But the spacing of the sound was wrong, like something was pausing between movements, like it was thinking. The third shift was closer, just behind the Volkswagen's rear bumper. I sat up, heart tight in my throat. I didn't move the curtain. I didn't breathe. I listened. Nothing. Then a faint scrape across metal. My metal. Something touched the hatch, lightly, almost curious. I could feel my pulse climbing into my ears, that familiar rising hum of tension that I always tried to push away. This was the moment where I'd normally tell myself it was nothing, that fear was just imagination. But imagination doesn't make metal scrape. I reached silently for the lantern switch. My fingers hovered, trembling. Another scrape, but lower this time. Near the undercarriage, I turned on the lantern. The bright sudden light filled the cabin, and instinctively I leaned forward to peer through the back window, only to realize the light was reflecting too strongly for me to see anything outside. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't let myself consider. Whatever was out there knew I was in here. It wasn't sniffing blindly or passing by. It was investigating. I grabbed my keys and shuffled to the front seat, trying not to make noise. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them once. The keys hit the floor with a small, impossible-to-ignore clink. Outside, the scraping stopped. I froze. Seconds passed, 1, 2, 5, maybe more, before the sound returned, but farther away this time, moving toward the far end of camp, toward the SUV. I swallowed hard and lowered myself into the driver's seat. I didn't start the engine yet. The noise would be too loud, too sudden. Instead, I watched through the windshield, my breath shallow. The SUV sat motionless in the dark. Then, from behind it, a shape moved. Not a full silhouette, just a shifting distortion in the darkness. Taller than a person, wrongly proportioned, like something crawling upright but uncomfortable doing so. I blinked. The shape vanished. When I leaned forward, squinting, I saw only the empty desert again. The SUV. The quiet basin. My skin crawled. My thoughts split between primal warning and desperate rationalizing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe exhaustion was messing with my vision. But I hadn't imagined the scraping. I started the engine. The sound was too loud, too final. But I didn't care. I just needed to move. As I shifted into reverse, my headlights caught something on the ground behind me. Footprints, but not human. Not animal either. Wide, deep, and spaced in a way that made no anatomical sense. I stared at them, breath locked in my chest, unable to do anything but feel the creeping chill slide over my spine. And before I could react, before I could even begin to process what I was seeing, a distant sound drifted from the direction of the mines. A hollow knock, then another. Slow, rhythmic, like someone or something was calling from inside. I kept my foot on the brake for a long moment, my headlights locked on those impossible tracks behind me. The hollow knocking echoing faintly through the desert air. Each knock felt spaced apart just enough to keep me suspended in a kind of nauseating anticipation, as if the desert itself were holding its breath between each impact. I told myself it had to be an echo from some leftover mining structure, maybe an old metal door swaying in the wind. But the air was dead still, no wind, no movement, just me, the vast open dark, and something in the hills knocking with slow, patient intention. My instincts screamed to leave, to put the Volkswagen in drive and not look back. But I couldn't move, not until I knew whether someone, some human, might be out there. The overturned chair by the SUV flashed through my mind again, the missing footprints, the eerie silence. What if someone was trapped in one of those mines, barely clinging to life, trying to get attention before the desert swallowed them entirely? People disappeared out here all the time. Mines collapsed, hikers underestimated the terrain, and that smell I'd caught earlier, that faint, wet mineral scent, it wasn't just drifting on the air. It was coming from the direction of those old tunnels. I needed to know. Not because I was brave or because I trusted my instincts, but because if I drove away now and later learned someone had died out there, trapped while I sat in the comfort of my van, convincing myself it was nothing, I would never be able to live with it. My brother's words echoed in my head again, harsh as the memory always made them feel. You don't listen to your instincts because you're afraid of what they tell you. I dismissed him then, swallowed the sting. But right now, sitting in this valley of abandoned mines, I understood exactly what he meant. I shifted into park and let the engine idle. The knocking had stopped. The silence felt deeper for it, like a void waiting to be filled. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, turned it on, then turned it back off almost immediately, afraid the beam would expose me more than help me. Instead, I cracked open the door and let the cold night air sweep into the cabin. The smell was stronger now. Damp, heavy, like the breath of some deep underground cavity exhaling into the world. I stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the soft patches of earth that had unsettled me earlier. When I walked toward the SUV, I moved slowly, scanning the ground, expecting to see more of those tracks. But the way the sand had shifted around them made it impossible to tell where the creature, or whatever it had been, had gone. It was as if the impressions had sunken in unnaturally deep, then faded too quickly at the edges, melted into the surrounding dirt by something that knew how to hide its trail. I circled the SUV, shining the flashlight low to the ground. The overturned chair was still there, half buried. No signs of struggle, no signs of people, just that oppressive silence settling heavier with each step. I felt watched, not from the mines, not from the hills, from somewhere closer. I resisted the urge to swing the flashlight at every soundless corner of the desert. I approached the front of the SUV and froze. Something had dragged along the passenger door. Not with claws, not with fingers, with pressure. A long, bowed indentation ran across the metal as if something massive had leaned on it, just enough to cave the panel. I touched it with my fingertips. The metal was cold. Too cold for the surrounding air. My breath hitched. I stepped back, scanning the basin again. Nothing moved. My van sat alone on the other side of the clearing, its headlights cutting a narrow wedge through the night. I wanted to retreat to it, shut myself inside, lock the doors, but the knocking, the mine, the overpowering feeling that something was deeply wrong, it kept pulling my attention back to the hills. Maybe someone was trapped, or maybe someone had been trapped. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and began walking toward the nearest mine entrance, the one slightly set back from the others. My feet moved against every internal warning I had left. With each step, the air grew colder, the smell stronger. The ground beneath me shifted strangely, like pockets of dust were collapsing under my weight. When I reached the mouth of the mine, I felt an immediate drop in temperature, sharp enough to make my breath fog even in the desert night. The entrance was framed by splintered beams, old supports warped by time and disrepair. A rusted sign leaned crooked at the edge of the path, half-eaten by corrosion. Keep out. Unsafe. Federal property. But the ceiling rockfall I expected wasn't there. Instead, a narrow gap opened between fallen boulders, barely wide enough for a person to slip through if they turned sideways. A dark wound in the hillside. I lifted the flashlight and shined it into the gap. The beam died less than 10 feet in, swallowed by darkness so complete it felt almost solid. A cold draft hissed from inside, brushing against my skin with a faint, unnatural tremor. I should have left right then. Every instinct screamed to turn around. But before I did, I called out, "Is anyone in there?" My voice bounced off the rocks in a deadened echo, too soft, as if the mine itself absorbed the sound. No answer, just that faint, shifting cold. Then, from somewhere deep inside, a single knock. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even aggressive, but it was decisive, hollow, deliberate. I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my ribs. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. The urge to run surged through me. I nearly turned around, nearly sprinted back to my Volkswagen, but something held me there. The knock hadn't echoed like it came from deep inside. It felt closer, much closer, like it came from just beyond where the beam had vanished. I called out again, softer this time. "Hello?" A pause. Then another knock. 2 knocks, actually. Closer together, like an answer. I backed away until my shoulders hit a boulder behind me, the cold stone biting through my shirt. I scanned the hills again, half expecting to see that shifting shape from earlier, something twisting in the dark, but nothing moved. My thoughts raced. If someone was in there, hurt, dehydrated, disoriented, they wouldn't be knocking like that. They'd be yelling. They'd be desperate. They wouldn't communicate in those slow, spaced rhythms. No human trapped in a collapsed mine would be patient. My hands were numb now, not from cold, but from the realization forming in the pit of my stomach. Whatever was inside wasn't calling for help. It was responding. To me. Unable to stand another second near that gap, I turned and headed back toward camp, walking fast but not running. Running felt dangerous, like it might trigger something that was waiting for an excuse to move. The mine seemed to pulse behind me, the cold air following like a faint pulse. When I reached the midpoint between the SUV and my van, I stopped abruptly. Something stood between me and the Volkswagen. Just far enough that the headlights only caught the outline. Tall. Slightly hunched, its limbs wrong, too long in some places, too narrow in others, like it had assembled itself from the suggestion of a shape rather than the reality of one. I couldn't breathe. It didn't move, not toward me, not away. It simply watched, or faced me, or listened. I couldn't tell. The air around it seemed to vibrate, a faint thrum like wires under tension. Then it tilted its head, a smooth, unnatural motion, slow as cooling tar. Something inside me snapped, but not into panic, into purpose. I stepped back. Carefully, slowly. The creature, or whatever it was, didn't follow. It only tilted its head the other way as if studying my retreat. Then from behind me another knock echoed through the basin. Not from the mines this time. Closer. Much closer. I turned just enough to see movement in the dark behind the SUV, and for the first time that night, I realized with absolute certainty that I wasn't dealing with just one presence out here. There were two. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until the cold night air rushed painfully back into my lungs. Two shapes moved in the darkness now, one between me and my Volkswagen, the other somewhere behind the SUV, just out of the reach of the headlights. I stood there caught in a narrowing corridor of fear, the desert around me suddenly claustrophobic despite its emptiness. My mind trying to understand what my instincts already knew. Whatever these things were, they weren't acting on impulse. They were coordinating. The one nearest the van remained perfectly still, its silhouette a twisted suggestion rather than a complete form. The other, behind the SUV, shifted with a faint scrape of sand like it was adjusting its weight. The sound was small, but in that suffocating silence, it might as well have been a shout. The wind hadn't returned. The air was dead. Every sound belonged to them. My body wanted to run, but fear had rooted me too deep in the moment. I kept my eyes on the nearest shape and took another slow step back. The beam from my flashlight quivered in my hand, but I didn't lift it toward the creature. Something in me, something buried, primal, knew that shining a light directly on it would be a mistake. Some animals attack when suddenly exposed. Some things move when they think you've seen them too clearly. And some simply don't want to be understood. The creature tilted its head again, even slower this time, like it was mimicking human curiosity, but didn't quite know how humans moved. My stomach knotted painfully. The wrongness of it was suffocating. It wasn't just the shape, it was the edges. They didn't look solid. They wavered, flickered minutely, like heat distortion on asphalt, as if the creature wasn't fully anchored to the world around it. A soft knock came again from behind the SUV, 3 taps this time, evenly spaced. And the creature in front of me responded, not with sound, but with a slight twitch in its posture, a signal, an answer. They were communicating. A cold wave of dread washed over me. These weren't wild animals stumbling through camp. They were aware, coordinated, watching me the way hunters watch something they aren't sure is worth the effort yet. I forced myself to take a breath, then another, trying to keep my voice steady as I whispered to no one but myself. Move slowly, don't run, don't turn your back. My van felt impossibly far away, even though it was maybe 30 yards across the basin. My mind calculated the distance, my chances, the terrain, the loose dirt, the patches of softened earth that had unsettled me earlier. If I ran and my foot hit one of those soft spots wrong, I'd twist my ankle, or worse, fall. And if I fell, no. I couldn't think about that. I backed up another step. Neither creature advanced. That unsettled me even more. Predators didn't usually hesitate this much. They didn't stand still, they didn't measure. But these things were waiting, watching, studying. My breath puffed in small clouds. The desert shouldn't have been this cold. The temperature drop felt intentional, like the air itself was reacting to their presence. My heartbeat hammered so loudly I was sure the creatures could hear it. And then, without warning, the one by the SUV stepped into a sliver of the headlight beam. Only for a second. But it was enough. Its leg, if you could call it that, didn't bend right. It folded too many times, like multiple joints stacked where a knee should be, and the skin, or the suggestion of skin, seemed stretched thin over something sharper beneath it. No fur. No roughness, something smoother and paler, a color the desert didn't know. When it shifted back into darkness, I felt my stomach lurch. I took 3 more steps backward. My flashlight shook harder. My legs trembled as adrenaline flooded my bloodstream, screaming at me to run. But the part of my mind, still capable of reason, thin and trembling, whispered that running was exactly what they were waiting for. The creature nearest my Volkswagen finally moved, not forward but slightly to the side, angling its body, cutting off a path, hurting me. My throat tightened. They weren't just hunting. They were cornering. A surge of defiance, brief, irrational, rose up in me. I wasn't going down here. Not in this desert. Not in front of the mines where men had disappeared a century ago. Not while standing between an abandoned SUV and my old Volkswagen that had carried me through every road trip, every lonely night, every stretch of land where I went to feel human again. I took another step back, this one slower, deliberate. The creature responded with a low, almost imperceptible shift, a reminder, a warning, and then something else happened, something that hit me harder than the fear. From deep inside the mind behind us, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, I heard a voice, a human voice, a man's voice. Someone, help, it was distant, trembling, muffled by rock and God knows what else, but it was unmistakably human. I froze in place, torn by the horror of what that meant. Someone really was in there. Someone had been knocking. Someone had survived long enough to call out into the cold desert night. And these creatures, these things were between me and him. The man called out again, weaker this time. Please, someone. My chest tightened with something more potent than fear, rage, determination. That instinct I'd been so afraid to trust all these years. I whispered, I hear you. The creature closest to me straightened as if it understood not the words, but the intention behind them. I shifted my weight slowly, trying to angle my body toward the van. If I could get inside, if I could just get the door shut and lock it, I could start the engine. Use the high beams, the horn, maybe scare them long enough to... The creature by the van stepped closer, just one step, but it was enough to send a pulse of panic up my spine so strong I thought I'd vomit. I kept my knees bent, ready to move, every muscle vibrating with the effort not to collapse. Behind the SUV, the second creature shifted as well, its long limb dragging faintly in the sand. The sound was so soft, so precise, it made my skin crawl. They knew I wanted the van. They weren't going to let me reach it. My throat felt like it was closing, every breath thin and scraping. My flashlight flickered again. I didn't dare bang it against my palm to steady it. Any sudden movement now felt like suicide. Then the man in the mine cried out one more time. Louder, desperate, breaking. Help me! The creatures reacted instantly. Both of them snapped their heads toward the mine entrance in the same synchronized, unnatural motion, like puppets jerked by the same invisible string. Their bodies stiffened, listening. The one closest to me rotated further, its outline shifting like a shadow pulling itself into a different shape. My heart punched a hole through my chest. They weren't here for me. They were here for him, the man trapped inside. And that meant they'd leave me the second he was within reach. As if the desert itself understood my realization, the cold deepened, the stillness thickening like a warning. My decision formed faster than my mind could process it. I had to move now. Right now. I didn't wait to think, didn't wait for courage, didn't wait for instinct. I acted. I lunged sideways, not toward the van, not directly toward the creatures, but toward the softest patch of earth I'd stepped on earlier, the one I'd been avoiding without knowing why, the one they seemed to ignore entirely. The moment my foot hit it, the ground sank just slightly, enough to buy me a fraction of uncertainty in their calculations. Enough for their attention to stay fixed on the mine. I sprinted, full speed. The creatures reacted, but not fast enough. Their heads snapped back toward me, but their bodies lagged, joints bending in confused stutters, as if my choice didn't fit the pattern they'd expected. I ran harder, lungs burning, boots slipping on loose earth. The van loomed closer, still impossibly far. My legs screamed. My chest felt like it was collapsing. The air behind me shifted, something moving, but I didn't look back. Looking back would slow me down. Looking back would kill me. The Volkswagen was only a few yards away now. Just a few more steps. And that's when I felt it. A cold, unnatural breath against the back of my neck. Too close. Far too close. I pushed harder, every part of me instinct, terror, and raw refusal. My hand shot toward the van's door handle. I yanked it open. And something behind me exhaled a low, shuddering sound, like disappointment. My fingers slipped on the door handle from sheer panic, but momentum carried me forward and I tumbled into the driver's seat, shoulder slamming hard into the console. Pain shot down my arm, white hot and immediate, but the terror behind me drowned it out completely. I twisted, dragging the door shut with every ounce of strength I had. The second it latched, something hit the side of the Volkswagen. Not a slam, not claws, a slow, deliberate press, like a palm flattening against the metal to test its strength. The van rocked subtly under the weight. A thin vibration rolled through the frame, like it was humming or breathing. I locked the doors with shaking hands. Click. The sound seemed to echo unnaturally loud inside the cabin. Then everything went still. The creature's weight eased off the driver's side panel like a reluctant retreat. I didn't dare move. Didn't dare look. I sat frozen in the glow of the dashboard light, my breath fogging the windshield as the temperature continued to plummet, the cold sinking into my bones as if the desert itself had turned predatory. Something brushed the back of the van, soft, like a fingertip gliding along the fiberglass hatch. Then another knock from the direction of the mine, loud enough to make the glass tremble. The creatures shifted. I didn't see them move. I felt it. The weight around the van lifted, the pressure on the ground shifted, the air stirred with that same metallic mineral scent of deep earth and old stagnant water. The knock came again, this time followed by a muffled cry. The man. He wasn't far now, or he wasn't alone in there. Something was happening inside that mine that made the creatures abandon me without hesitation. My instincts, the ones I'd ignored for years, roared to life. They're going after him. The thought struck like lightning, tearing through regret sharper than fear. I'd run. I'd save myself. And in doing so, I'd left someone behind in the dark with things that belonged to neither the desert nor the living. I forced myself to breathe, to regain even a shred of control. Shaking, I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and the creatures didn't return. Not yet. Not while they had something more important waiting in the mine. I dropped the van into reverse and swung it around, tires spitting gravel. I angled the headlights directly at the mine entrance. The beams cut across the basin, illuminating the SUV, the overturned chair, the disturbed sand, and two sets of tracks leading from the shadows toward the mine. Wide, deep, impossibly spaced. My stomach twisted. The creatures weren't just heading back. They were returning to something, a pattern. A cycle, something they'd done before. I killed the lights, let the engine idle, my breath fogged the glass. The entire basin was silent again, except for faint echoes drifting from the hillside. A dragging sound, a human groan, a wet, resonant thud. Then that same slow, steady knock. 3 beats. Pause. 2 beats. An answer. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Every survival instinct screamed at me to leave now before those things realized I was still here. But underneath that instinct, buried deeper, a heavier truth sat lodged like a blade. Someone was alive in that mine. Someone who had knocked, someone who had screamed, someone who had called for help while I ran. The cold, sharp breath that had touched the back of my neck moments earlier still lingered in my memory, a reminder of what waited outside the safety of the van. And yet, the thought of driving away, leaving that man to whatever those creatures intended, pressed down on my chest like a weight I couldn't bear. I'd always run. From arguments, from conflict, from my own instincts. Tonight, I had come within inches of running again, but something changed the moment I heard that voice. Fear didn't go away, but something stronger grew beside it. Resolve. I reached into the glove compartment and grabbed the only real tool I had, a heavy-duty camping lantern. Not a weapon, not even close, but it was something. A source of light strong enough to blind if aimed right. Something those creatures hadn't seen me use. I took a breath so deep it hurt. I turned off the engine. The night swallowed the noise instantly. For a moment, everything felt impossibly still, like the desert held its breath again, waiting to see if I would run or return. I opened the door quietly, each movement practiced, controlled. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't let myself hesitate. The lantern's weight in my hand steadied me, gave me something to anchor to as I stepped out and eased the door shut behind me. The basin stretched out ahead, darker without my headlights, the mine a black mouth in the hillside. No creatures in sight, no footprints moving, no shapes flickering at the edge of vision, But the sounds inside the mine continued, soft, rhythmic, almost coaxing. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks, a reply. I started walking toward the hills, each step deliberate, silent, controlled. The lantern hung at my side, unlit, a dormant threat. My breath curled in white wisps as the temperature dropped further, the air pressing down on me with every foot I gained. My heart pounded like it was trying to warn me. My instincts whispered that I was making a mistake. But something deeper, something older, told me the truth. If I left that man behind, I'd never escape this night. Even if I survived, something inside me would always remain trapped in that mine with him. The closer I came to the hillside, the colder the air became. My fingers numbed. My jaw ached from tension. The entrance loomed ahead, darker than the space around it, almost absorbing what little light the stars offered. A faint, broken voice drifted from inside. "Please, help." I gripped the lantern tighter, lifted it slightly, my thumb hovering over the switch. A soft scuff of sand sounded to my right. I stopped instantly, breath catching. In the darkness near the rocks, something shifted. No knock, no call, just the quiet suggestion of movement, a reminder, a warning. The creatures weren't gone. They were waiting for me to choose. The mine behind me, the darkness beside me, the cold sinking deeper. I lifted the lantern slowly. My thumb pressed the sweat, exploded into the night, and something in the dark moved.